The dishwater was losing its heat, turning greasy and gray around my wrists. I could smell the sharp, clean bite of the homemade lye soap, mixed with the heavy, sweet scent of the parsnips we'd eaten for supper. It was February. In Pennsylvania, February doesn't just sit outside the house. It presses against the walls, finding every tiny seam in the wood, sending thin ribbons of ice across the floorboards if you stand still long enough to feel them. Behind me, the cast-iron wood stove gave a small metallic click as the metal contracted. It was a comfortable, ordinary sound. The kitchen was thick with the warmth of it, the kind of heavy, sleepy heat that settles into your wool skirts after a long day of chores. The children had gone upstairs an hour before, without much trouble. I could still hear the occasional faint creak of the ceiling joists as they shifted in their sleep, the easy, uncomplicated weight of childhood. Elam was in his usual place. He sat in the low-backed wooden chair by the stove, his shoulders dropped forward, his large, calloused hands holding a small German prayer book close to the oil lamp. He had his feet flat on the floor, the heavy leather of his work boots looking dark and solid against the scrubbed pine boards. It was the exact posture he took every single evening once the horses were fed and the tools were put away. It was a posture of absolute settlement. He looked like a man who had grown out of the floor itself, immovable, predictable, safe. I rubbed a thumb over the rim of a stoneware plate, scraping away a stubborn crumb of the dark bread I'd baked on Tuesday. My eyes lifted. Above the sink, the window was small and square. In the summer, it showed the kitchen garden and the dark edge of the woods where the deer came out at dusk. But in the winter, once the sun dropped behind the ridge at 4 o'clock, the glass changed. The pitch black of the fields turned the pane into a mirror. Not a clear, bright silver mirror like the ones English people have, but a deep, smoky, unforgiving glass that showed you the room in shades of charcoal and amber light. I looked at the window. I had looked at it 10,000 times before in the years we had lived in that house. I knew every bubble in the glass, every smear where the grease from the frying pan had settled before I wiped it clear. But that night my hands stopped moving in the water. In the dark glass I saw Elam. He was a silhouette of amber light and shadow, his head bowed over his book, his profile sharp against the whitewashed wall behind him. And then I saw myself. I was standing at the sink, my shoulders hunched, my arms buried in the gray water, my face a pale, blurred oval in the reflection. We were in the same room. We were breathing the same warm, wood-scented air. We were enclosed by the same 4 walls, under the same roof, bound by the same holy vows we had made before God and the elders. But in the glass, the truth of us was laid bare. We were turned away from each other. He was facing the stove, looking inward toward the heat. I was facing the window, looking outward into the black nothing of the fields. There were perhaps 8 feet of floorboards between us, a space you could cross in 3 easy steps. But the angle of our bodies made that distance look like an ocean. We were in the same warm kitchen on a cold February night, and we were pointing in completely different directions. A strange, heavy stillness dropped down over me. It wasn't a sharp pain. It wasn't the kind of sudden, tearing grief that makes you drop to your knees. It was something much quieter and much more terrible. It felt exactly like the moment a sound you have lived with for years suddenly stops. Like a grandfather clock that has ticked in the hallway since you were a child. A sound so constant that your mind stopped hearing it a decade ago. And then, one afternoon, the weight drops, the gears click, and the ticking stops. The silence that rushes into that empty space is so loud it makes your ears ring. It makes you realize for the first time what you had been carrying all along. I stood there for a long time, my hands growing cold in the greasy water. The oil lamp flickered once, casting a long, dancing shadow across Elam's face in the glass. But he didn't look up. He didn't move. He simply turned another page of his book, the paper making a dry, whispering sound in the quiet kitchen. Slowly, I pulled my hands from the water. I let the dishcloth drop into the sink with a soft, wet thud. I took the linen towel from the wooden peg, dried my skin until it was red and chapping from the cold air near the window, and I said nothing. I didn't say good night. I didn't ask him if he wanted another cup of tea. I just walked out of the kitchen, climbed the narrow wooden stairs where the cold lived, and crawled into bed. I lay there for 4 hours awake in the dark, watching the frost form geometric patterns on the corner of the bedroom window, my breath rising in small ghostly clouds before vanishing. I didn't know what I had seen yet, not fully. The mind takes a long time to find the words for what the eyes take in a single second. I didn't have a name for the emptiness. I just knew that something inside my understanding had shifted, like a heavy stone sliding down a hillside. And I knew with a cold, absolute certainty that it was never going to slide back up. My name is Ruth. I was Old Order Amish, raised in the green, rolling hills of Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. I left the community when I was 24 years old, walked away from the only world I had ever known, the only people who knew my name. The night at the kitchen sink was not the night I left. The actual leaving, the packed bag, the midnight walk down the gravel lane, the terrifying blackness of the outside world, that was still 2 full years away. There was a long, slow road ahead of me, a road made of quiet choices and heavy silences that I hadn't even begun to walk yet. But that February night was the night the road first became visible. It was the night the fog cleared just enough for me to see where I was actually standing. Have you ever had a moment like that? Not a scream, not a dramatic explosion, or a tearful confrontation, but just a quiet evening on an ordinary Tuesday, where a reflection or a shadow shows you a truth you can never unsee. If you know that feeling, that sudden, quiet cracking of your world, I want you to tell me about it in the comments below. And if you want to understand how a woman goes from washing dishes in a quiet Amish kitchen to standing completely alone in the modern world, please subscribe. The road only gets deeper from here, and I want to share the rest of it with you. 4 years. Elam and I had been married for 4 years by that frozen February. 4 years is a specific kind of milestone in our community. It's long enough for the initial awkwardness of a new marriage to wear off. Long enough for the performance of being newlyweds to stop, and for the actual life to simply settle into the floorboards. In the beginning, there is a lot of noise. The wedding with its hundreds of guests, the passing down of iron skillets and quilts, the constant, low-level tension of learning how to share a small bedroom with a man you barely know. But by the 4th year, the dust settles. What you are left with is just the actual thing. The marriage, as it genuinely is, stripped of the expectations, and the actual thing was not bad. I need you to understand that, because it is the hardest part of the story to explain to anyone who didn't grow up behind the white picket fences of the church. Elam was not a cruel man. He did not raise his voice, and he never raised his hand. Every single morning, long before the sun even thought about cutting through the gray Pennsylvania mist, I would hear the heavy thud of his boots hitting the floor. He would walk down the dark stairs, his woolen socks whispering against the pine, and he would go out into the freezing barn to milk the cows. He worked with a terrifying, beautiful consistency. He did exactly what he was built to do, from the ground up, without ever asking why. He was a good provider, and by the community's standards, he was a capable father. He was always there, dependable as the seasons, performing his duties with a quiet, heavy faithfulness, even when his bones ached with winter damp. He was kind, too. Genuinely kind in the tiny, unrecorded details of a shared day. If a horse was stubborn, he didn't whip it. He spoke to it in low, rumbling German until the animal calmed down. If he saw my hands were chapped from the lye soap, he would quietly bring in an extra armload of firewood, so the kitchen stayed warm while I worked. He was a decent, honest man, but goodness and closeness are 2 entirely different countries. We had been put together by a community process that looked only at the visible things. Our families shared the same church district. Our fathers agreed on the boundaries of the fields. We were both quiet, healthy, and committed to the old ways. On paper, we were perfectly compatible, but inside that word, compatible, there is a terrifying amount of empty space. There is room enough for 2 people to live in the same house for 40 years and remain absolute strangers. We had never actually spoken to one another. We talked, of course. We talked about the price of hay, the cough the youngest baby had developed in January, the upcoming church service, and who was going to help with the barn raising down the road. We spoke in the short, functional sentences of people running a business together. "The wind is shifting from the north," he would say, staring into his coffee mug. "I'll put the extra blankets on the children's beds," I would reply, wiping the counter. "The woodpile is getting low by the porch. I'll have Elam Jr. help me bring more in after midday." That was the texture of our life. Simple, practical, locked in grease and wool, but I didn't know what Elam was afraid of when the lamps were blown out. I didn't know if he ever looked at the horizon and wondered what was on the other side of the ridge, or if the rules of our life felt like a tight harness around his neck the way they did around mine. I didn't know if he ever felt lonely, and he had no idea who I was either. He knew the Ruth who baked the bread, the Ruth who kept her head covered with the white organdy cap, the Ruth who nodded when the elders spoke and kept her mouth shut. He had married the visible version of me, and he honestly believed that was all there was. He didn't know about the secret stack of English books hidden in the bottom of my cedar chest, or the wild, dangerous thoughts that hammered against my ribs while I sat in the church bench for 3 hours on Sunday, listening to the ministers preach about submission. Outwardly, I was the perfect Amish wife. I ironed his shirts until the pleats were sharp as knives. I kept my eyes cast down when we walked through the market. I whispered, "Yes, Elam," whenever a decision had to be made. But inside, I was suffocating in the silence. Every time I tried to reach across the 8 feet of space between his chair and my sink, my words would just bounce off his quiet, steady decency. He wasn't shutting me out on purpose. He just didn't have the words. He had been raised in a world that taught men to express love through sweat and muscle, not through language. The interior world, the world of doubts and questions and deep, private longings, did not exist in his vocabulary. He was a good man trapped in a system that didn't give him the tools to see his own wife, and I was a lonely woman watching our youth slip away in a warm, silent kitchen. About 2 months after that February night, when the winter snow was finally rotting into gray slush along the ditches, I went to see Clara. Clara was older than my mother, a heavy-set woman with hands that always smelled of dried lavender and vinegar. She was an anomaly in our church district. She had lost her first husband when she was only 22, spent 12 long years living entirely alone in a small cottage at the edge of the woods, and then married again in her late 40s. In a world where people move seamlessly from their father's house to their husband's house, Clara had spent over a decade outside the circle. She was the only person I knew who had seen our life from the inside, then from the outside, and then from the inside again. She possessed a rare, quiet quality of assessment. She had compared. We were sitting on her porch, snapping the woody ends off early asparagus. The air was damp and smelled of turned earth. I didn't tell her about the window. I didn't have the courage for that. Instead, I kept my eyes fixed on my green apron and whispered a smaller thing. I told her I was finding marriage harder than I had expected. Clara stopped her hands. The snap of the asparagus died away. She looked out across the brown fields for a long moment, her lined face completely still beneath her black bonnet. "The hardest part isn't the difficulty, Ruth," she said, her voice dropping into the quiet between us. "The hardest part is finding out that a person can share your bed and your table and your whole life and still be somewhere you cannot reach." I went home and sat with that word for weeks. The reaching, that was exactly what I had been doing in the dark. The tragedy of our community is that we do not have separate categories for proximity and intimacy. To the church, being together is being together. Sharing a roof, sharing a checking account, and raising children means you are known. The deep, aching distinction between physical presence and actual interior contact was a language that had never been handed to either of us. Small attempts in the quiet eye didn't try to explode our life. I wasn't thinking about running away yet. I just wanted to see if the distance could be crossed. In June, when the air was sweet with the first cutting of hay, I tried a different angle. Elam was cleaning his boots on the back porch, the scrape of the metal tool rhythmic and dull. I stepped out and stood near him, watching the grease-stained leather turn dark under his fingers. "Elam," I asked quietly, "what is it you like about the farm? Not what is useful or important for the family. What do you like personally?" He stopped scraping. He looked up at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before. A strange flickering look of deep uncertainty, as if I had asked him to explain the weight of a cloud. He looked back at his boot, cleared his throat, and spoke so softly I had to lean in. "I like the early summer mornings," he muttered, "when the fields are still cool and the light comes in at that low angle across the alfalfa. Everything is quiet before the day starts properly." My heart gave a small, desperate leap. It was a beautiful sentence. It was a piece of him. I stored it away in my mind like a precious gold coin. But within 2 minutes, the heavy gravity of our habits pulled us right back down. He stood up, stamped his boots, and said the north fence line needed checking before the rain came. The small, real thing he had confessed sat on the porch floor like an object neither of us had the tools to pick up. He wasn't shutting me out. I know that now, looking back through the lens of 40 years. He wasn't withholding himself out of malice. He simply did not have the vocabulary. He had been carved into a man who expressed love through sweat, through fixing broken wheels, through showing up every single day to plow the earth. The spoken, examined interior life I was starving for was a language he had never been taught to speak. The voices in the August dark, the breaking point of that understanding came in August. It was a suffocating night. The air thick and yellow with humidity, completely breathless. We were lying under a single sheet, the windows thrown wide open to catch any stray breeze from the orchard. The crickets were a loud, vibrating wall of sound outside. Suddenly, into the thick silence of that bedroom, Elam spoke. He didn't turn his head. He just looked straight up at the dark ceiling. "Do you think the children are all right, Ruth? Not just healthy. I mean inside. I don't always know how to tell." I lay perfectly still, my breath caught in my throat. I was so stunned by the question, so entirely unprepared for him to speak into the emptiness, that I couldn't find my tongue. Before I could answer, his voice came again, even smaller this time, almost swallowed by the dark. "I don't always know how to tell with you either." I lay there in the suffocating heat, my tears running hot and silent into my pillow, and I thought, there you are. Right there. The ghost I had been chasing through the house was chasing me too. The person I had been desperately trying to reach across the kitchen floor was standing on his side of the chasm, reaching back into the same blackness, using the exact same broken, unlearned language. We were both drowning in the same silence, completely separately, unable to find each other's hands because the architecture of our world, the roles, the church, the beautiful and terrible certainty of tradition, kept us locked in our places. It has been 12 years since that August night in the dark. I live in a small city apartment now, on the second floor of a brick building, where the low, distant hum of traffic never truly shuts off. I have electric lamps that flood the rooms with bright, immediate light at the flip of a plastic switch, and my kitchen window looks out onto a narrow paved alleyway instead of black, frozen cornfields. It is a completely different life, built on choices I had to learn how to make entirely from scratch. But some images never leave the back of your eyelids, the progression of Grief the February window. The two shapes in the smoky reflection pointing away from each other. I am not angry about that image anymore. I was for a long time. In my first years in the English world, the anger was like a hot coal in my stomach. I blamed the church, I blamed the strictness of our traditions, I blamed Elam for his heavy, unyielding silence, but anger is a shallow emotion. It burns fiercely, and then it leaves only ash. After the anger came the sadness, which is a much larger country. It took years to move through that grief, to let it settle into the deep places where it doesn't sting every time you take a breath. Now, when I look back at that warm kitchen, I don't feel bitterness. I mostly think about the waste of it, the cost of silence to decent, well-meaning people living under the same roof, sharing the same bread, both reaching out into the dark separately, and never knowing that the other one was reaching too. That is what I want people to understand about the world I left behind. I am not here to tell you a story about absolute evil or cruel villains. I am not here to tell you that Amish marriages are inherently miserable, or that Elam was a bad husband. He was a good man. He acted out of a sincere care, out of habit, out of a quiet, steady devotion to the only truth he had ever been handed from the day he was born. He was doing his absolute best with the tools he had. The tragedy is the friction of the system itself. A way of life that does not teach people the language of their own interiors will inevitably produce two people who love each other, yet cannot find each other. They will live together for 50 years, they will build a farm, they will raise a family, and everyone will call it a good marriage. And they will have absolutely no idea what that conformity actually cost them inside. I know what it cost. I know the price of a life where the most real parts of who you are must be kept buried forever. Your turn in the quieted. I am sitting in my kitchen now, looking at my own reflection in a clear pane of modern glass. The road that started at that sink took me through places of terrifying emptiness. But it brought me to a place where I can finally speak my own mind without fear. But I know I am not the only one who has stood at a window like that. Tell me in the comments below if you know that particular suffocating loneliness. The one that doesn't look like a crisis to anyone else. The loneliness that lives quietly inside a marriage, a career, or a life that looks, from the outside, completely fine. I want to hear your soul in the comments. Let's talk about it. And if you want to hear how I finally packed my bag and stepped out onto that road into the dark, please subscribe. There is a new story here every single week, and there is still so much more to say about what came next.